The kitchen was unusually quiet, save for the sound of Grace's fingers tapping nervously on the table. The edges of her wedding planning binder were slightly worn, the pages full of notes and sketches of what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Her parents sat across from her, each lost in their own thoughts, the unspoken tension hanging in the air like a cloud waiting to burst. Grace had always imagined that when it came time to plan her wedding, her parents would be there, not just emotionally, but financially, as they had been for every milestone before. After all, she was their daughter, the one who never asked for much, the one who had always been self-sufficient. But today, as she sat across from them, something in the air felt different. "Grace, we need to talk," her mother said, finally breaking the silence, her voice far too calm. Grace lifted her gaze from the binder and met her mother's eyes. "About the wedding?" she asked, her voice tentative. Her mother paused, then glanced at her father, as if seeking his approval to proceed. His response was a quick nod, the motion subtle but enough to send a sharp pang through Grace's chest. "Grace, sweetheart," her father began, his tone even but laced with something that felt like disappointment. "Your mother and I have been talking about the wedding for a while now, and we've come to a decision." Grace's heart beat faster. She felt a knot form in her stomach, the words that followed hanging in the air like a threat. "We won't be able to contribute financially." The words struck her like a slap to the face. She stared at them, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. This wasn't just about the money, it was about everything she had ever worked for, everything she had ever hoped for. Her parents, who had always been there for her siblings, had now drawn a line in the sand. "Wait, what?" Grace's voice cracked, a mix of shock and disbelief. She could barely find the words. I thought you'd help with this, like you did for Emma's wedding." Her mother's face tightened, the smile she wore only moments before, now gone. "Grace, you know it's not the same. Emma's situation, she needs our support more than you do. You've always been so independent. You're fine on your own." Her father leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "You've got a good job, Grace. You're capable. This wedding, it's your choice, your responsibility. We just can't put the money into it. We have our priorities." Grace's hand trembled slightly as she pushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. This couldn't be happening, not now. Not when she was finally living the life she had worked so hard for. She had always believed that her parents would be there for her, that they would help her make her dreams come true, just as they had for her siblings. But in this moment, it felt like all of those years of effort and success meant nothing. But Grace began, trying to find her voice. "Emma's wedding wasn't any less important than mine. I've been planning this day for months. I've been working for it. And now you—" "Grace, please don't make this about Emma," her mother interrupted, her voice strained but firm. "It's just not something we can do. We've already helped you in so many ways. You've always had what you needed. This is different." A heavy silence fell between them. Grace's heart pounded, the words her mother had said echoing in her mind. "You've always had what you needed." Was that really true? All the years she had worked tirelessly, school, jobs, internships, doing everything she could to earn her place. But now it seemed like none of that mattered. Her father's gaze softened just slightly, but it didn't offer any comfort. "Grace, you're our strong one. You've always figured things out. This is just another challenge you can handle." Grace's chest tightened. Her voice barely above a whisper, she responded, "So I'm supposed to figure this out? Alone?" Her father's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked to her mother for a response, but she only shook her head, a gesture that cut deeper than any harsh words could. Grace stood up abruptly, feeling her breath quicken as the reality of the situation crashed down on her. "Fine," she said, her tone a mix of hurt and anger. "I'll figure it out. But don't act surprised when this wedding doesn't look the way you expect it to." She grabbed her bag and turned toward the door, not waiting for their response. As she reached for the handle, her mother's voice stopped her. "Grace," her mother said softly, "don't be like this. We're just being practical." Grace's hand froze on the door handle. She could hear her mother's voice tremble, but there was no going back now. She was done pleading. If her parents couldn't support her in this, she would do it herself. She would make this wedding her own. "Goodbye, Mom," Grace said, without turning around. I'll handle it." With that, she left the house, the door closing softly behind her. The sound seemed to echo through her mind as she walked out into the world, now more determined than ever to prove that she didn't need her parents' approval to make her dreams come true. Grace sat in her car, the engine idling but her mind miles away. The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, blurring her vision. She wiped them away quickly, trying to regain control. She needed to think clearly, but the hurt and the sting of rejection felt suffocating. Her phone buzzed in her lap. A message from her best friend, Lila. "Everything okay? Call me when you can. Love you." Grace stared at the message for a long moment, her finger hovering over the reply. She wanted to call, to vent, to cry about the injustice of it all. But instead, she took a deep breath and put the phone down. Number she couldn't afford to wallow. Not now. Not when the wedding was only a few months away, and there was still so much to do. She started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, her destination clear. If her parents weren't going to help, she'd do it herself. It would be hard. She had no idea how she was going to make it work, but she had always made things work. She had to. The first thing she did was stop by the cafe she worked at in the mornings. It was a small, cozy place with mismatched chairs and tables, always full of customers chatting over lattes and pastries. Grace had worked here since she was in college, and the owner, Rosa, had become like a second mother to her. She needed someone who understood her, and someone who could help. Grace pushed the door open, the familiar bell jingling as she stepped inside. Rosa, a woman in her late 50s with curly gray hair and a warm smile, looked up from behind the counter. "Grace, what's going on, kiddo? You look like you've seen a ghost." Grace gave a tight smile, walking up to the counter. "You've got a minute?" Rosa's eyes softened as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Of course, always. Take a seat." Grace slid into one of the chairs near the window. The cafe was quiet now, with only a few regulars sipping coffee at the counter. Rosa followed her, setting down a cup of tea and sitting across from her. "So, what's this about?" Rosa asked gently, settling into the chair with an expectant look. She was a woman of few words but great insight, always knowing when something was wrong without needing to be told. Grace sighed, trying to gather her thoughts. "My parents, they refused to help pay for my wedding." Her voice wavered at the last words, and she hated how vulnerable it made her sound. But she needed to say it. She needed to let someone else hear it. "I don't know why, but they've always treated me like I don't need help. But this is different. I can't do it all on my own." Rosa reached out, placing a hand over Grace's. "You're a fighter, Grace, but that doesn't mean you have to do it alone. You've got people who love you and will help." Grace shook her head. "I don't want anyone to feel like they have to help. This is my wedding, my responsibility. But I don't even know where to start. I need to figure out how to pay for the whole thing." Rosa's eyes twinkled with a knowing smile. "I've seen that look before. You're gonna make it happen. You always do." Grace wasn't so sure, but she appreciated Rosa's belief in her. "I've been thinking about doing a crowdfunding campaign," she said, almost as if saying it out loud would make it more real. "It sounds crazy, but I've seen people do it for everything these days. Weddings, medical bills, you name it." Rosa raised an eyebrow. "It's not crazy, honey. You have a community. You've helped so many people through the years. I think they'd want to help you too. But you've got to make it personal, Grace. People don't donate because you need money. They donate because they believe in you. Show them your story, your heart." The words settled in Grace's chest, the idea forming in her mind. It wasn't just about the wedding, it was about her story, her journey. She had always been the one who kept her struggles to herself, kept quiet, kept strong. Maybe now was the time to show people who Grace really was. Not the independent daughter who never asked for help, but the woman who was willing to fight for what she wanted, no matter the cost. "I can do this," Grace said quietly, more to herself than to Rosa. "I'll make it happen. I'll show them that I can do this on my own, and maybe they'll see that they've been wrong about me all along." Rosa smiled softly, her eyes full of wisdom. "You don't need their approval, Grace. You've already proved yourself. This is your wedding. You don't have to make anyone else's expectations fit into it. You do it the way you want. You've earned that." Grace took a deep breath. the first breath of freedom she'd felt all day. Maybe this was the moment she needed. She would prove to herself, to her parents, and to everyone who had ever doubted her that she could do this. And when her wedding day came, it would be on her terms. As she stood to leave, Rosa handed her a napkin with a scribbled note. "If you need anything, I'm here." Grace smiled, tucking the note into her bag. "Thanks, Rosa. I think I'm ready." And with that, Grace stepped back into the world, her heart a little lighter and her determination stronger than ever. The next few days were a blur of determination. Grace threw herself into planning her wedding with an intensity she hadn't known she was capable of. Each morning she woke up earlier than usual, armed with her laptop, a cup of coffee, and a list of everything she would need to tackle. The idea of crowdfunding had been a lifeline, but she quickly realized that to make it successful, she would need a strategy, a way to present her story, to connect with the people who would want to help her. Sitting at her desk, Grace stared at the blank page of her crowdfunding campaign. She had read about people raising money for weddings before, but never once had she imagined it would be her own story. The words felt foreign, yet necessary. The goal wasn't just money, it was her chance to prove that her independence wasn't just about self-sufficiency, but about creating her own future. She wasn't asking for a handout. She was asking for support in building the life she had worked for. She typed the first line, paused, and then typed again. "I'm Grace, and I've always been the one to take care of things on my own. But now, I'm asking for help. Because this is one thing I can't do alone." She stared at it for a while, unsure if it sounded too vulnerable, too desperate. But then she realized it wasn't about perfection. It was about authenticity. She was asking people to help her build the life she wanted, not out of need, but because this was the next step in her journey. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Lila. "I'm getting the feeling you're about to do something big. I want in. You need help? You know I'm your girl." Grace smiled, her heart lifting. Lila had been with her through everything: college, breakups, career changes. And now, she was willing to help make Grace's wedding a reality. She quickly typed a reply. "I've started the campaign. I'll need help spreading the word, organizing everything. Are you up for being my wedding planner?" A few seconds later, Lila's response appeared. "Are you kidding? I've been planning this wedding in my head for years. Let's do this." Grace laughed softly, feeling a warmth in her chest. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The next week was a whirlwind. Grace posted the crowdfunding campaign, sharing it with her friends and family on social media, writing heartfelt posts about her journey and her desire to make her wedding day her own. She wasn't going to let her parents' refusal define her. Every post was carefully crafted to convey the message that this wasn't just about the wedding. It was about showing up for herself, about taking control of the life she had worked so hard to build. There were moments of doubt, of course. Grace couldn't help but wonder what her parents thought of her campaign. Were they judging her for turning to the public for help? Was this somehow making them feel like failures? But then she would remember the sting of their rejection, the words they had said about her being independent, and the hurt she had felt in their refusal. If they couldn't help, she would find another way, and she had already taken the first step by doing it herself. Within a few days, the donations started rolling in, slowly at first, then with greater momentum. It wasn't just her friends contributing. People from all parts of her life, old colleagues, former professors, even distant relatives, sent money with kind words of encouragement. "I believe in you, Grace. You deserve this day to be everything you've dreamed of. Your strength has always been inspiring. Wishing you the best on this new chapter." The messages that came with each donation filled her with a sense of validation. She wasn't just raising money for a wedding, she was building a network of people who believed in her, who had seen her struggle and succeed. She wasn't asking for charity, she was asking for support. And that made all the difference. Grace found herself thinking about her parents less and less. They had made their choice, and she had made hers. This was her moment, and it was no longer about proving something to them. It was about proving to herself that she could make her dreams a reality, even without their help. One evening, after finishing another batch of thank you messages, Grace sat back in her chair, a quiet sense of accomplishment washing over her. The wedding was still months away, and there was so much to do, but she had taken control. She was doing this on her own terms, and that meant everything. Lila called the next morning, excitement evident in her voice. Grace, I just found the perfect venue. It's a little off the beaten path, but it's gorgeous, and it fits our budget perfectly. You have to see it. Grace's eyes lit up. Send me the details. I trust you. Lila's voice was full of energy as she continued. And I was thinking, maybe we could get some local businesses involved. You know, flowers, catering, maybe even photographers. You have a whole community rooting for you now, Grace. Let's make this wedding something unforgettable. Grace smiled. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. She was doing it. She was making her dream wedding come true. Not because she had the financial backing of her parents, but because she had the drive, the creativity, and the support of those who truly cared about her. No more waiting for permission. No more hoping for someone else's approval. Grace was finally taking control of her life, and that included her wedding. It had been a few weeks since Grace had launched her crowdfunding campaign, and the response had been overwhelmingly positive. Her wedding fund was growing steadily, and more importantly, she felt a sense of control she hadn't felt in months. The once insurmountable task of organizing the wedding had become manageable, thanks to Lila's help and the network of people who believed in her. Every day felt like a small victory, a reminder that she didn't need to wait for anyone's approval to live her life. But as much as things were falling into place, there was still a nagging thought in the back of Grace's mind. Her parents. They had barely spoken to her since that fateful conversation in the kitchen. And whenever they did, it was brief and strained. She knew they were upset with her decision to go public with her wedding plans, but she hadn't expected the distance to feel so permanent. One evening, just as Grace was sitting down to dinner with Lila, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her mother. Grace, we need to talk. Can you come by tomorrow? It's important. Grace stared at the screen for a long moment. She hadn't heard from her parents in weeks, not unless it was about something trivial. Her heart began to race. What did they want now? Was this going to be another attempt to guilt her into backing down? Lila, who had been scrolling through her phone, looked up and noticed the tension in Grace's face. What is it? Grace showed her the message, and Lila frowned. Are you going? I don't know, Grace replied, her voice tight. I don't know what they want, but I feel like I need to hear them out. Lila nodded in understanding. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, but if you're going, just remember, you're doing this for you. You don't owe them any more explanations. Grace gave a small nod, appreciating her friend's support. Lila was right. This was about her, and whatever her parents said, Grace had made her choice. She was building her life on her own terms, but still, she couldn't ignore the need to confront them. She needed to hear their side, even if she knew it might hurt. The next day, Grace drove to her parents' house, her heart heavy with a mix of anticipation and dread. She had no idea what they were going to say, but something told her this conversation wouldn't be easy. When she arrived, her mother greeted her at the door, her face unreadable. Grace, she said softly, stepping aside to let her in. Your father's in the living room. Grace nodded, taking a deep breath before following her mother inside. Her father was sitting in his usual spot on the couch, his arms crossed, his expression hard to read. Grace couldn't tell if he was angry or disappointed, but she knew this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. Sit down, sweetheart, her mother said, gesturing to the chair across from her father. Grace sat, feeling the weight of the moment. She didn't know how this was going to play out, but she knew she had to stay strong. She wasn't going to let them make her feel small again. She had already made her decision, and nothing they said would change that. There was an awkward silence before her father spoke, his voice surprisingly calm. Grace, we've been thinking about this for a while, and we realize maybe we weren't fair to you. Grace blinked, stunned by the admission. For so long, her father had always acted as though everything she did was fine on its own, as though she didn't need anything from them. But hearing him say that now, it didn't erase the years of neglect, nor did it make the hurt go away. We know we haven't always treated you the way we should have, her father continued, his voice steady but laced with regret. We've always been proud of your independence, but we didn't realize how much it was costing you. We never saw it. Grace's throat tightened. It wasn't just the independence, he said quietly. It was the constant feeling that I was never enough. that no matter how much I did or how hard I worked, it was never going to be good enough for you. Her mother's eyes filled with regret. That's not what we meant, Grace. We've always loved you, you know that. We just didn't want you to feel like you had to rely on us for everything. We wanted you to be strong. Grace shook her head, the bitterness creeping up her spine. But you never gave me a chance. You've always been there for Emma, always supported her, even when she didn't need it. And me? I've had to fight for every ounce of recognition, every bit of support. Her father looked down, unable to meet her eyes. Grace, I know we've made mistakes. We're sorry for that. We're really sorry, but we want to be part of your wedding. We don't want to miss this. The words stung. Grace could feel the old wounds opening, but this time, they were different. She didn't need their validation. She didn't need their money or their approval. She needed them to understand the impact of their actions. You can be part of my wedding, she said slowly, her voice steady. But it's not going to be like before. I've learned a lot over the past few weeks, and I've realized that I don't need your approval to make this day special. I can do it on my own, and I am. Her parents sat in stunned silence, the weight of her words hanging in the room. Grace didn't need them to fix everything now. She didn't need them to suddenly be the parents she had hoped for. But maybe, just maybe, this conversation was the beginning of something new. Something that didn't depend on their approval, but on her own sense of worth. After a long pause, her father finally spoke, his voice quieter this time. We'll respect that, Grace. We just wanted to make things right. Grace nodded, the tension in her chest easing. She wasn't asking for them to make things right in one conversation. That would take time. But today, she had taken the first step toward healing. I know, Grace said softly. But I need you to understand this wedding, this whole thing. It's not just about me and him. It's about me too. And I'm finally learning to do things for myself. Her mother wiped a tear from her eye. We understand, sweetheart. We really do. As Grace stood to leave, she felt a sense of quiet resolve. This wasn't the resolution she had hoped for, but it was the beginning of a new understanding, one that was rooted in her own strength. She had built this life for herself, and no matter what happened next, no one could take that away from her. It had been a month since the conversation with her parents, and Grace had thrown herself even deeper into the planning. The wedding was shaping up to be everything she had hoped for. If not exactly what she'd originally dreamed of, it was hers, every detail carefully curated by her own hands. Lila had been indispensable, organizing meetings with local florists, photographers, and caterers, many of whom had offered their services at a discounted rate after hearing Grace's story. The crowdfunding had taken off faster than Grace had ever expected. People who barely knew her had sent donations, inspired by her determination and resilience. There were messages of support, both heartfelt and unexpected. Grace had started to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time, a deep, overwhelming sense of gratitude. As the wedding day drew closer, Grace found herself standing in the small venue they had booked. A rustic, charming place, tucked away in the woods on the edge of town. It wasn't the grand hall she had imagined, but it felt right. The soft twinkling of fairy lights, the wooden tables adorned with wildflowers. It was everything she needed and more. She looked around, picturing her guests, her friends, and her parents. Her parents. It was an uncomfortable thought. After the conversation, they'd continued to stay somewhat distant, still unsure how to approach her. They hadn't offered financial help, but they'd made it clear that they wanted to be involved. And while Grace appreciated their attempt to make amends, she couldn't ignore the fact that the trust had been broken. Still, she had decided that she would invite them, not for their money, but because this day wasn't just for her and Mark. It was a symbol of everything she had been fighting for. The morning of the wedding arrived with a gentle breeze, the sun shining brightly through the trees. Grace stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection, the delicate lace of her wedding dress catching the light. Her heart fluttered with excitement, but a quiet unease lingered in the back of her mind. She had done this. She had built it all from the ground up. But the presence of her parents still loomed, and as much as she had prepared herself, there was no denying the weight of their absence during the process. They hadn't been there when she needed them most, but now they would be there, not as saviors, but as part of her life, her journey, her choices. Lila's voice broke her thoughts as she knocked on the door. "Grace, it's time." Grace smiled, taking a deep breath. "I'm ready." The ceremony was simple, just as Grace had envisioned. No grand gestures, no extravagant displays, just her, Mark, and the people who had supported them along the way. As Grace stood at the altar, surrounded by her closest friends, the reality of what she had accomplished settled in. The love she had worked so hard to cultivate wasn't dependent on anyone else's validation. It was hers, and it was real. When her parents walked in, Grace's heart skipped a beat. They had arrived quietly, sitting in the back. Her mother's eyes met hers, and for the first time in a long time, there was a soft understanding in her gaze. It wasn't everything, but it was something. The ceremony itself was a blur, filled with laughter, vows, and promises. Grace felt the warmth of the sun on her skin, the rustling of the trees in the breeze, the comforting weight of Mark's hand in hers. As they exchanged vows, Grace's voice shook with emotion. "I promise to never stop fighting for us, for this life we're building together." Mark squeezed her hand gently, his voice steady as he said his own vows. "I promise to always stand beside you through everything, even when it gets hard. You are my heart, Grace." When they were pronounced husband and wife, Grace didn't think about the past anymore. She thought about the future and about the woman she had become. The woman who had refused to settle for less than she deserved, even if that meant walking down a different path than she had imagined. The reception was a joyful celebration. People laughed, danced, and ate, enjoying the evening under the soft glow of fairy lights. Grace moved through the crowd, greeting guests, feeling a sense of belonging she hadn't known was missing. She was surrounded by people who had been there for her, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The love in the room was palpable, and it was a love that wasn't contingent on her parents' approval or financial support. At one point during the evening, Grace found herself standing by the window, watching the sunset. The day had gone smoothly, the atmosphere relaxed and beautiful. Her parents had come up to her earlier, offering apologies for the past and expressing their pride in who she had become. But as Grace looked at them from across the room now, she realized something. She didn't need their apology. She didn't need their validation. She had already given it to herself. "You're really doing it, aren't you?" Lila said, joining her by the window. "I knew you had it in you." Grace smiled, the weight of everything she had been carrying suddenly lighter. "I didn't just do it, I earned it." Lila chuckled. "You sure did, and you've got a whole army of people cheering you on. This wedding is just the beginning, Grace. You've got so much ahead of you." Grace turned to look at Lila, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." Lila winked. "You're welcome, but you did it yourself. You always have." As the evening wound down, Grace found herself alone for a moment, her dress swishing around her as she took a quiet walk outside. The night air was cool, the stars twinkling above her. She stood for a moment, taking it all in, the joy, the love, the feeling of accomplishment. This wedding, this day, was more than just a celebration of her marriage. It was a testament to everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for. It was proof that, despite the challenges, despite the obstacles, Grace had chosen her own path. And that path had led her here, to a life built on her own strength, her own decisions, and her own love. When she looked up to see Mark approaching, a smile tugged at her lips. He reached out for her hand, and together they walked back inside. The future was waiting, and Grace was ready for whatever it held. The months that followed were filled with new beginnings. Grace and Mark settled into their new home, a small but cozy place filled with laughter, love, and the occasional chaos of two people navigating their lives together. Grace continued to grow in her career, taking on new projects that challenged her in ways she never imagined. And through it all, she knew that she had built her life from the ground up, without anyone's help, without anyone's approval, but with the love and support of those who mattered most. Her relationship with her parents had improved, though there was still a distance between them that would take time to heal. But Grace had come to understand that healing was a process, not something that could happen overnight. What mattered was that she had found peace within herself, and that for the first time in her life, she was living on her own terms. At the end of each day, Grace would sit with Mark, reflecting on everything they had accomplished together. And as she looked ahead to the future, she knew that this was only the beginning. No matter what challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them with the same determination, strength, and love that had gotten her to this point. She had learned that sometimes you don't wait for someone else to give you what you need. Sometimes you take matters into your own hands. And that was exactly what she had done.